The pendulum swings back and forth, every tick-tock echoing the passing of time. But there was a time before clocks, not just before modern clocks, but before pendulum clocks, before grandfather clocks, before alarm clocks, wristwatches, or even those clocks with the weights that wind up at the top. So how did people keep track of time before all those clocks? Well, first, they had to figure out what time was, and it's easy enough to tell time based on the sun's position in the sky. After all, we have 12-hour clocks because of the sun. We divide the day into 12 hours based on the positions of the sun relative to the stars. But the sun isn't always out. If it's cloudy, you can't use it to tell the time. And at night, obviously, you can't use the sun either. That means there needed to be another way to measure the passage of time when the sun was hidden. Luckily for us, water flows at a pretty consistent rate. And in ancient Egypt, engineers built a device known as a clepsydra, which is the Greek word for water clock. The basic design consisted of two vessels with water flowing from one to the other at a constant rate. By marking the hour vessel, they could tell the current time by seeing how full the receiving vessel was. In this case, the only moving part of this water clock is the float valve here. And as the receiving vessel fills, the float rises, eventually turning off the spigot when the vessel is full. What's interesting about this design is that it does not rely on any regular energy source like a weight or spring. Instead, it relies on gravity and surface tension. Clepsydras were widely used throughout history, including in ancient Greece, Rome, China, and Islamic lands, and often found their way into sundials, which helped them work at night and on cloudy days. But these designs weren't completely accurate. You see, the flow of water doesn't stay exactly the same in different temperatures. When it gets hotter outside, the water tends to flow a bit faster, and when it gets colder, the flow slows down. And in very cold weather, water expands as it freezes and could even break the container. They also tended to be sensitive to vibrations. Plus, if someone wanted to steal it, they could just pick it up and walk away with it. But people still wanted better ways to measure time, even if you have a pocket full of quarters. First, let's get some coins out of here. Imagine your favorite tabletop game, like Monopoly or Scrabble. It doesn't matter if you play it with your friends or your family, it's just relaxing to take a little break from the real world. There are games like that in the new Curiosity Stream catalog. The first game show ever, called Lingo, where contestants try to guess secret words based on verbal clues. Or how about Master Minds, where contestants answer questions based on those old-timey optical illusions. Or maybe you want to learn something while you play. Try Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, where it doesn't matter if you're British or American, everyone loves to answer trivia questions and win money. Curiosity Stream has thousands of documentaries and non-fiction titles from game shows to cooking shows to everything in between. And now, this lets you watch with your friends, family, and co-workers, and then discuss your thoughts during and after the movie. You can even play fun games together. With so much good stuff to watch, you'll never run out of conversation topics. And after you've watched a few episodes of your favorite game show, you might think the best way to measure time would be to count the number of games you win, which would be great if you always won. But no one does. So you could use a device that counts the number of times something else happens. In the late 17th century, a Dutch scientist named Christiaan Huygens created a device that counted the number of times a pendulum swung back and forth. At first, he used it to time astronomical observations, but soon others adapted his device to make clocks. These clocks were immune to temperature changes unlike water clocks, and didn't need a constant supply of water or delicate tubes. They also worked even if they were moved from place to place. Soon, pendulum clocks became the standard and remained so until the advent of quartz clocks in the mid-20th century. But there was another problem. Pendulum clocks were big and bulky. Sure, they were more portable than water clocks, but they were still hardly pocket-sized. And for people who really needed to keep track of time while on the go, they needed something smaller. Enter the hourglass. Like water clocks, an hourglass measures time by letting a granular material flow from one container to another. But unlike water, sand doesn't slow down in cold temperatures. And because sand particles are so tiny, you don't need a float valve to turn the flow on and off. It will stop by itself when the bottom vessel is full. But the reason we use sand is because it's dry. If water evaporates over time, leaving an hourglass with less and less water. The amount of time it takes to fill the receiver vessel will vary depending on the temperature and humidity, making it less accurate. Sand doesn't have that problem. It's also not affected by vibrations, so it's more reliable if you're carrying it around. However, you do have to flip it over periodically, which is annoying but necessary. Otherwise, the sand will eventually stop flowing altogether since it builds up on the top of the second container. Another problem is that since you can't see inside the containers, you don't know how much sand is left. So unless you memorize how long a certain amount takes to flow, you don't know how much time has passed. That's why hourglasses are often used for short periods of time where you know the exact amount of time you need. Like 5 minutes is a common amount of time for an hourglass. Another solution to keeping track of time without clocks requires thinking about things that happen multiple times per day instead of once. We're talking about the humble egg timer, also known as an egg timer for obvious reasons. Fill it with water, put it in the microwave, and wait for it to hatch. Of course, you don't actually have to use it to time eggs, though. People have been timing food for millennia, and it helps to make sure your recipe turns out well. For example, the ancient Romans used a timed egg to determine whether the wine was ready to drink. An egg in a leather bag would be tossed into a wine container to settle any sediment at the bottom, and after a precise amount of time, its buoyancy would indicate whether or not the wine was clear enough to drink. Likewise, today, cooks use timers to ensure their creations turn out properly. Seafood paella, for instance, needs to cook for 45 minutes minus 10 minutes for each pound of meat added to the pan. Cooking times like these are essential for a dish to turn out right. And sometimes you'd better not add any more protein lest you mess up the carefully calibrated cooking process. So far, we've seen devices that measured time by counting the flow of water or falling sand, the swing of a pendulum, or the intervals between chicken clucks. But what about the simplest method of all, measuring time by listening to a bird that wakes up before sunrise? Well, you may be familiar with the song of the rooster, but most birds sing many songs, not just the iconic cock-a-doodle-doo. And roosters don't always wake up at the crack of dawn. Although studies suggest they generally prefer to crow early in the morning, giving warnings to their human counterparts to get up and start the day. While the rooster's call has inspired paintings and poems for centuries, farmers have relied on them to wake up at consistent times for even longer. A single bird may not be entirely reliable, but having several birds, it's a pretty good bet that one of them will wake up early enough to get you out of bed. In fact, chickens have been selectively bred by humans for thousands of years to have more desirable traits like waking up earlier. It wasn't until the 16th century that alarm clocks began to replace them, although alarm clocks didn't become common in rural areas until the 20th century. When you hear a rooster crow, you usually hear it just once, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you hear several crows in succession. And in ancient Greece, that was a good thing. The sound of the cock crowing twice was associated with the god Zeus and was thought to be a good omen. But the sound of a cock crowing 3 times was bad news. It was believed to be the harbinger of death. Ancient Greeks kept detailed records of cocks that crowed 3 times and compiled them in a book called the Tetrabiblos, meaning 4 books, which was used to predict whether or not someone would die within the next 12 months. Luckily, modern science has made a lot of progress since then, and the odds of someone dying in the next year can now be predicted with significantly more accuracy. And it doesn't require any dead birds. Now watch, how long does it take to die in space, or check out everything you didn't know about time for even more ways people kept track of time before clocks.